Let's get more now on the Whyalla steelworks support package announced today by the state and federal government. Dr. Daniel Rossetto is an adjunct senior lecturer at the University of Adelaide and joins us now from Adelaide. Daniel Rossetto, welcome. So if the steelworks is not commercially viable under its existing management, is it worth spending billions of taxpayers' dollars to keep it going?
In principle, there are different cases for spending taxpayers' funds. But if a new shareholder can be brought in who's got a lower cost of capital, that could certainly ease the operating cost pressures on the business. And then I think in terms of public funding, we need to be very careful about the subsidising the business by too much. But I guess it's a very important business for Australia, and therefore it requires very serious consideration.
Okay, so how significant is this particular steelworks as a provider of steel products for Australia?
Well, it's a major provider. It's one of the two largest steel production plants in Australia, together with Port Kembla. So it is at a national level, and to the extent that steel production in Australia is a very important commodity for national security and defence-based industries, then it's a very important business.
Yeah, so what would be the danger economically for Australia if this steelworks folded?
Well, the economic impact would be we'd probably, in the short term, need to turn more towards imports of steel. And that's in the sort of short to medium term, while different solutions are developed domestically. Of course, if the business itself is not viable, then it may be very difficult to find another buyer to come in and take control of the Whyalla plant. So that would leave a fairly significant economic problem for Australia. And import reliance is something that's been increasing in Australia in the steel sector over the last decade or so.
And do the possible Trump tariffs make it more important that Australia can produce its own steel?
Ironically, the Trump tariffs could potentially present Australia with an opportunity to import lower cost steel. And that's simply because producers in other countries who may now find it more difficult to sell steel in the United States may actually look for other opportunities. And if there really is an overcapacity in steel production globally, then that could potentially represent lower costs of steel inside the Australian market.
Yeah, and would that then harm the viability of keeping this operation going?
Yes, I mean, there are potentially some competitive impacts there. The other thing we need to evaluate here is that there's what's called a safeguard mechanism being introduced as well, which is covering the steel sector, and that is basically to regulate emissions. So there are lots of different elements here at play, and the tariffs in the United States, albeit indirect, need to be carefully analysed in terms of the viability overall of the steel industry in Australia.
And so what are the chances of governments, because the state and federal government are involved in this, finding a new owner? Because they want to, as you've mentioned, they want to get a new owner involved in this. They're going to pump a huge amount into developing infrastructure. Their $1.9 billion of this $2.4 billion package has been set aside for that. So what do you think the chances are that a private operator will come in and take it over?
That's going to be a real challenge, and I think there are two issues there. One is the viability of the business itself, and it's got the Whyalla facility has a history of ownership change in the last 10, 15 years. So there's been a significant problem there in terms of retaining ownership over a long period of time. But the other thing which is really important, and this may be an unintended consequence of the political activity that's led to the administration status of the business now, is that this is something that investors from abroad at least will look at and say, this is a potential risk, a sovereign risk relating to taking ownership of a steel asset in a place like Australia. So that may well be an unintended consequence of what's happened and place additional pressure on the ability to find a new owner.
So do you think this was a good call today by the governments to stump up with this money?
It's really difficult to conclude one way or the other as yet. However, it seems as though there's a lot more to this story than we have yet found out. And it all happened in quite a rush. In general, I think subsidising the steel industry is fraught with difficulty. But in special circumstances, and particularly where national security is involved, then I think we need to look very closely at these types of packages. So I think we're going to need to wait and see as to whether that funding package is going to be value or is going to deliver value for money in the medium and longer term.
And what do you mean when you say there's still a lot to find out?
Well, I think it's been very difficult to understand the overall financial position of this business in terms of the information that gets made public. We also don't know a lot about how the proposed hydrogen plant that the South Australian government was going to develop actually integrates with the steel plant. I think there's some mixed messages there, like the government proposal says it's going to be an electricity generation plant. Yet Premier Malinauskas in the last few days, when he's been talking about needing a customer, is suggesting that he's going to be selling, or the plant is going to be selling, hydrogen to the steelworks. So there needs to be more clarity, I think, about exactly what that project was for, as well as the general financial condition of the Whyalla business.
Okay, Daniel Rossetto, thanks so much for talking to us from Adelaide.
My pleasure.